The good stuff is happening after the podcast comes out. But a lot of people are focusing on the front end of getting on a podcast and neglecting the end. People think they need more content. You don't need more content. You need more distribution. Because it's one thing to say you're great. It's another thing for someone else to show you in a light that says, hey, I do believe this person is who they say they are. Really leverage the fact that you've been on a podcast.
It's time to reinvent.
Leveraging other people's audiences, other people's platforms, other people's networks. And that's part of proactively getting more people into your marketing funnel. Your own social media can have a few people, but you want to get the message out there because remember, conversion rates sometimes being between 2 and 3% or 2 and 5%. Now imagine 2% of 100 is different from 2% of 1,000. It's different from 2% of 10,000. You get the point. So we want to get as many of the right people aware of what we do, because if people don't know that we exist, they can buy from us. And the goal of a small business owner is not necessarily to have a big following, but to create more business for yourself. That's the goal of the small business owner, to serve people so that they get interested in what it is that you do. Today, we're going to talk about podcast guesting. And why podcast guesting? Think about the shelf life of things you post on social media. If you post on X, whatever you've posted has got a shelf life of maybe 15 to 30 minutes. If you post on Instagram, you've got a shelf life of maybe 48 hours. If it's a story, 24 hours. If it's a reel, maybe a couple of days, which highlights that point that whatever the platform is promoting is the thing that you should try and do more of, because you're aligning with their goals. Like right now, Instagram, Facebook, they're promoting reels. Look, the shelf life of reels is greater than any other type of post that you can do on this platform. So it only makes sense to create a post that has a greater shelf life. The shelf life of TikTok is a couple of days. For YouTube, if it's a short, is a couple of days. If it's long form, like a long video, that can be even a year or more than a year, as long as it's something that is evergreen and people have a common interest around that. So when you're creating content, you start to think about all of those things. As you post your small account and you're putting quality things out there and you're repurposing proactively, you don't leave things to chance. Yes, you're optimizing your social for the algorithm to do its thing, but you also want to try and get yourself in front of as many people as you can. And what you get from leveraging podcast guesting is you've got someone who's built a community around an interest, a niche. And instead of your post reaching 1 or 2 people a day, not only are you reaching more people at once that may not have known about you through what you're already doing, you're also able to, one, create credibility for yourself because people associate you with that podcast. A tip that I got from one of our podcast guests was that you can take the logo of the podcast that you have appeared on and put it on your website, as seen on, and a podcast that you've been on. You can use the logos and link the episode that you appeared on. This is creating media assets for yourself. And sometimes people are not sure whether you're a real thing, but if they see that other people have lent you their credibility by allowing you to be on their podcast, people are tired of people selling things that they can't deliver on. People are tired of it just being marketing. Naturally, they're skeptical. So create more credibility. Anyway, let's jump into podcast guesting. So the first thing, you already have your optimized socials. Then you begin to pitch podcast hosts to get onto their podcast. Because the first thing that someone is going to do the moment you pitch them, if they're interested, is they're going to go to your social. So you make sure that everything is okay there because that's where they're going to go next. When you're looking for podcasts to guest on, you want to make sure that there's a natural alignment between the interest-based community that the person has created, their niche, and what you're offering or your business. It's got to make sense. So, for example, I had someone who was telling me that they've written a book and it's about accountability, and they're trying to podcast guests on shows where they can leverage the fact that they were on the show as proof to market to HR people, and so that they can do workshops in businesses, essentially. And so this person, naturally, because they've got a book on accountability and their end goal is to sell workshops to businesses, it only makes sense that they would get on podcasts that talk about small business leadership or just leadership in general. They get on the show, they bring their A game, they're trying to connect with HR professionals on LinkedIn, right platform. So they're going to post on LinkedIn the appearances on these shows, the takeaway from the shows. If they're clips, they'll also place them there on their LinkedIn and the host may link with them. And that gives them that credibility. When they do approach different HR practitioners, the HR person is going to go to their profile and they're going to see, oh, okay, they've been on this podcast. Let me have a listen. Oh, they've been on this other podcast talking about this and they've written a book. You're creating more credibility for yourself for the end goal that you have, whatever that may be. Begin with the end goal in mind. That's basically what I'm saying. Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He says, begin with the end in mind. Finding the podcast that you should appear on. You can use AI to narrow down which podcasts you should pitch. You can tell it, this is who I am, this is what I do, this is the offer, or whatever your end goal is. This is the offer that I'm promoting. Which podcasts should I appear on? And see what the AI says, and then keep refining that conversation. That's a shortcut for you to have an idea of your first few podcasts that you'd like to pitch. The thing with pitching podcasts is that you really have to follow up because you're not the only person who's pitching podcasts. Everybody right now knows that the attention is in social and the attention is in media assets. Another tool that you could think about using, this video is not sponsored by them, but I have used this tool many times and I still continue to find guests through this tool for my podcast, is podmatch.com. And it's basically an AI app that matches podcast guests and podcast hosts based on common interest. So that's a great place to start if you'd like to quickly get in there and create a podcasting sprint. For you to get the most out of podcast guesting, I wouldn't recommend just doing one podcast or 2 podcasts and then leaving it. I would suggest setting up a goal in the quarter. Just do it as a sprint because, of course, it takes a lot of energy to promote what it is that you're doing. But it's something that if you create a podcasting sprint, you try to appear on 10 or 1 each week for the quarter, so 12 podcast appearances. And then after a quarter, you can reflect on the results. You can take a look at which podcasts did you gain more interest from, where people were responsive, or what was the result of your podcast guesting. So you found your podcast. You're creating a pitch. Most podcasts want you to have what is called a one-pager. You can search this online. You can see examples of it. You can even ask your AI tool to help you to craft a one-pager for a specific podcast. What you get out of the AI is what you feed it. So make sure that you're very specific about the type of podcast, the type of guests that they're looking for, and how to craft your one-pager to be attractive to that podcast host. One thing as a podcast host that I know that people love is someone who has researched the podcast. If you listen to at least 3 previous guests, get a sense of what the podcast hosts typically asks, what their interest is, how long it goes for. Also, if you can, leave a review. Some people leave a review and they let you know they've left a review. So, in a way, it gives you that feeling of reciprocity because the fact that they've left you a review to help you also promote your work, you feel, oh, let me give them a chance to also promote their work. So a lot of podcast hosting, guesting, a lot of it is that reciprocity and collaboration, really building relationships. So from those 3 past guests, you want to look at what were the things that were in common. So you get a sense of the aim of the host. And then you also want to think about what can you add to the conversation, which is what you really want to speak to in your one-pager. And give them supposed titles. You've looked at the previous episode's titles, so you have a sense of what kind of titles they would be interested in. Give them a few 4 suggested titles, suggested questions, because you want to give the podcast host the impression that this is going to be easy. It's going to be easy working with you. You've sent them already everything they need. They've got a good picture of you. They've got possible topics. They've got possible questions that you're ready to answer. Your social, they've gone on your socials optimized. It looks good. You are a real person. And so all those things are really important. And then, of course, the follow-up game. Track, even on a Google spreadsheet. You want to track the first date on which you reach out to the podcast with your one-pager. And then maybe 7 days later, you want to reach out to them again. Maybe another 5 days later, you want to reach out to them again. Because like I said, people are busy. A lot of people are pitching. On a busy day, you don't read all your emails. And maybe that's the day you pitch. So that follow-up is really important. Now, preparing for being on the podcast, I would say make sure that you have a few stories that you can tell, because it's one thing to give people information. It's another thing to share your experience through a personal story. People are really interested in that, and podcast hosts really appreciate that. If you can share your own experience and you can share actionable insights for their guests, don't hold back, because this may be your only chance to get in front of this person's audience that they've built up. And the last thing you want is for it to feel like when they ask you a question, you just give a little and the rest is buy my program. At the end of the day, if people like you, you're relatable, you've given them something that can get them a quick win, and you've displayed that you know what you're talking about, let them come into your world. Because from the podcast guesting, I think this is a misconception, because sometimes people think because they've been on a podcast, immediately it equals sales. And sometimes it may. You may just be that phenomenal, and that person just happens on their buyer journey to have just been looking to buy. I just need to be convinced that this is the person I want to buy from. There are those people in the market at any one point in time who are ready to buy. So that can happen. But more importantly, you get a chance to bring people into your world. This is something to avoid. Don't turn the episode into a sales pitch, because if you do that, you reduce the likelihood that the host is really going to share and promote that episode, because no one is going to really go all out to promote an episode that is someone leveraging their audience so that they can do a sales pitch, because that's not the agreement. It should be mutually beneficial. You share your expertise, you share your story to their audience. They promote it. They're happy that their audience walked away having gotten something valuable from that conversation. That's very important. With storytelling, you also don't want to turn it into a sob story, because people are really suspicious of that now. You hear a sob story, immediately you feel like you're being manipulated. Sometimes you do have a sob story, which is fine if that's your personal story, but you always want it to have a positive outcome or something at least that inspires the person. The goal of this is to get people interested in what you do. You're building that know, like, trust, so that they do want to buy from you. Remember, you're sowing seeds for sales through your content marketing. Being relatable is really important. So, for example, you're speaking to early entrepreneurs, and then you talk about your $100 million deal that you were able to close. That specific audience, if they can't relate to that, and that is your story that you want to share, you have to find a way to make that relatable. Maybe the focus wouldn't be on the $100 million deal, but the focus would be on your journey, who you saw yourself as when you started this journey, things that you had to battle with as you were growing as an entrepreneur. People can relate to that. And then, of course, your story is that you got a $100 million deal. I'm not saying don't share that, but I'm saying emphasize the things that are relatable, where people can see themselves in what it is that you're saying. Then have something to share, a lead magnet, where people can get more into what you're doing and you can get people into your funnel. Here's a little controversial thing about free lead magnets right now, is that a lot of people are on the hunt for freebies. And that's okay, because when you're starting out, I've been on the hunt for freebies. I've been in just about every freebie out there. Okay, good freebie is a good freebie. And people will talk about you, even if they don't buy. The people that I've gotten value from, I've always told other people about them. The most effective form of marketing still remains word of mouth. So people get the freebie and they don't buy, but they do tell other people about how good this was, and this person they discovered who spoke on this podcast and listened to this podcast and get this freebie. It still accomplishes the goal of your marketing your business and marketing yourself. Some people feel that the freebie lead magnet is something that is coming to an end, and it might be. Lately, I've bought lead magnets for $3, $1.99, and I get the strategy behind it. I think a lot of people, especially big time entrepreneurs, get a whole bunch of the wrong people on their list because of free magnets. But that also shows you the level at which they're operating. Everybody will sign on to lead magnets from whoever is the top person in their industry, but they can't necessarily afford your services. So even though they're in your funnel, from the beginning, they're not the right person, because they're not who it is that you're trying to reach. But I think when they get you to pay $2, $1.99, or $3 for their super valuable lead magnet. What they do is they sift away all the people who are just browsing. The fact that you're willing to take out your card and pay is a very important one, because with content marketing, a lot of it is not getting someone to do one big thing in one go. Sometimes it is, if they're at that point in their buying journey. But a lot of times it's asking people to take little steps in the right direction. So get this lead magnet. Oh, they were willing to put in their email address. And then from the lead magnet, do this if you'd like, this and this. It's tiny little steps towards a bigger sale. And that intent of a person who's willing to pay and a person who's not willing to pay, those two people are very different. But anyway, that's up to you and the strategy that you have for your business. But it's something to keep in mind to say, look, you can have a free lead magnet or you can have a very low cost lead magnet. But at the end, the goal is to get them in your funnel. If you've shared your why very well in the podcast episode, this is a way for them to convince themselves by watching the videos, reading the blog articles, buying the book and reading the book. I'm looking for evidence to support my buying decision. Now, this part is very important because most people go on podcasts and it ends there. Huge mistake, because post the podcast guesting. Make sure that you promote the podcast to your audience. You want to promote yourself creatively, socially. So, for example, sometimes you see someone just post, oh, I was on this podcast having a conversation with this person. Check out my podcast episode. That would have worked maybe a year or more ago, but not today. Today, you actually have to craft a hook, a moment in the podcast that you think your audience would be interested, or a thought you had from the podcast, or something to capture the person's curiosity, something that opens a loop in the mind of the person that they want to know, what did you talk about in this podcast? It sounds like a lot, but it's actually not, because you can prompt your AI to say, help me to find the moment in this podcast episode that would draw the curiosity of someone, or that I can ask a question that intrigues the person to go and listen to the podcast. Give me 5 moments, pick from those and trial and error those 5 things. But really, this part is the most important, because not only have you been on the podcast, the host has promoted it, you're promoting it to your own audience. They're your follower or subscriber, but they haven't been paying much attention to what you've been doing lately. Bring them back in with something that's interesting, something to draw their curiosity, where they get to listen to you, be shown in the light of an expert by another person. That's a powerful point of view. And then make sure that you keep in touch with your podcast hosts. And this is easy with social media. Connect with them, and every once in a while, show your support for whatever it is that they're doing, because they are growing their platform, they are growing their audience, just as you're growing your business. At some later point in time, you may want to appear on their podcast again, or you may want to leverage that connection that you have. So it's important to always be building relationship. Don't do a podcast and then ghost the person. The opportunity is really after the podcast has gone live. If it was a video and audio, you can repurpose the videos for your own social media, newsletters, blog articles, because it's one thing to say you're great. It's another thing for someone else to show you in a light that says, hey, I do believe this person is who they say they are. So that's important. Really leverage the fact that you've been on a podcast. And if you're doing that sprint where you're doing it in 12 weeks, you might not be able to get all those things out or have your team get all those things out. But what you can do is, in the next quarter, following the fact that you had a podcast sprinting quarter, in the next quarter, you're just making sure that you are repurposing all the things you did in the previous quarter. If you do that, you've got so much content just from those, and then your own content that you're producing, which I talked about, and how to masterfully repurpose content so you don't spend all day doing it and it doesn't burn you out. So if you do those 2 things, people think they need more content. You don't need more content. You need more distribution. Milk those appearances on podcasts, your own content, repurpose it. It's not a lack of enough content. It's really not distributing your content well. Focus on content distribution. Like I said, the good stuff is happening after the podcast comes out. But a lot of people are focusing on sort of the front end of getting on a podcast and neglecting the end. So if you really are masterful in setting up simple systems to make sure that your content distribution after the podcast is done well, That's going to be good. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening in. If you have any questions, please put them down in the comments. I'd love to know what you think about all these things. I share with you my ideas, my frameworks, my experiences, things I'm working on, where I am, and I'd love to know where you are in your journey.